arborist. Um, so our topic this morning is kind of an overview of tree and shrub management. And Chris is an arborist with Rainbow Treecare, and I know they provide a wide range of services for to manage trees and shrubs. And I'm just very grateful to Chris to be able to join us this morning. I know this is it's an important topic for my association. We have hundreds of trees and we are concerned about that. We want to maintain them, and I'm sure that you have in your associations as well. And they're part of the urban forest, and we're charged to take care of that. And so anyway, I don't want to get too much into the introductions, but I really want to welcome Chris, and I'll turn it over to you, Chris, and we'll just be admitting people as they come into the meeting this morning. But go ahead, and if you'd like to share slides or anything, just let me know and we can do that.
Sure, sounds good. Well, thank you, Lynn. Appreciate the opportunity to shed a little light on tree management and what it entails, how it came to fruition, if you will, for lack of a better term, and go over overviews on what a tree management plan can look like, what's the possibilities for individual needs and community needs. But before I go into that, I'd like to welcome everyone. I hope everyone is staying healthy and remaining safe as we continue to navigate through the world we currently live in, which seems like it's very distant, but excuse me, becoming a little more personable and face-to-face. So unfortunately, we're not face-to-face. I wish we were. I think there's a lot more power behind being face-to-face, but we'll get through the Zoom and the over the internet exposure, if you will. But I'm Chris Naselli. I'm a ISA certified arborist with Rainbow Tree Companies. I've been in the green industry for over 20 years. I began my career in landscape architecture, originally born and raised in Chicago, working on some high-end commercial properties along Lakeshore Drive, Michigan Avenue. And long story short, relocated to the Twin Cities 19 years ago. Been working with Rainbow Treecare for 14 years and really manage our urban forest through science-based practices. And in 2009, I was the arborist that discovered emerald ash borer in the Twin Cities for the first time, and have had a lot of exposure to many different invasive pests that impact our urban forest, as well as our very common disease and insects. And so to give a little background on tree management plans and how those came into play, early in my career, I've always been a forward thinker and a detailed assessor, if you will. And a lot of what we do to manage the urban forest is assessing, looking at the trees as individual units within a larger community setting, if you will, or urban setting, and utilizing science-based practices based on the knowledge of species that exist and following best management protocols. And so, like I mentioned, 2009 emerald ash borer came into play. And I believe that emerald ash borer was pivotal in the development or awareness of needing to act with our trees. And what I mean by that is responding to a desired outcome for the future. And in many cases, that's to preserve, protect our urban forest. And how do we do that? Well, we do that by full assessments and inventories. And that's what it all starts with, is an inventory, knowing what we have to work with within communities. And that can go all the way down to the shrub level or perennial level for many cases. And so, really having a desired outcome to manage our landscape, if you will, for lack of a better term, including our urban forest. And if I may, I'd like to share an inventory and what it looks like from a standpoint of what can be delivered for a community when an inventory is created.
Okay, Chris, you should be able to share your screen now.
Perfect, thank you. So what you see here is a full inventory of this townhome community's trees, and all of the trees are identified by their species. And during that development stage, we measure all of the trees by diameter inches.
Hey,
And
Chris,
so it's, yes,
we're not seeing your image there. I mean, we see you, but not what you're projecting.
can you see it now?
Yes, yes.
Very good. So again, this is an inventory of a townhome community that was developed, and all the trees are fully assessed. They're identified by species, they're measured by diameter inch. Everything in arboriculture, when we're looking at managing diseases and insects, is all relative to the diameter inch of the tree, or the size of the tree, wood fiber at chest height, which is called diameter at breast height, DBH. And as you look through this inventory, you can see there's a legend that identifies each species of tree and the quantity of trees. And each tree has its own number associated with it, or the name, if you will, that would remain with that tree for the life of the tree. And so it's trackable, meaning we can keep history of anything that has ever been done or recommended for an individual tree within the greater community. And so it becomes a very powerful tool from a budgeting and planning standpoint. All of these plot points, if you will, or tree locations are identified via GIS, GPS capabilities. So these are all sub-meter accuracy in its location. And they could be moved around, they could be deleted. Pretty much every single tree that you see has its own layer on there. And so there's a lot of power behind isolating out very specific tree species. Like if we use green ash, for example, we can develop an inventory map based on the full inventory that only would show green ash trees. And so that could be, broadcasted for the association, the community, if you will, if you have websites or whatnot for homeowners to be aware of, where specific trees are located, or specific services that may be upcoming for those individual tree species. With that being said, we also create, I'm going to go into a different shared screen here. Bear with me here a moment. Can everyone see this pie chart?
Yes.
Very good. So as we develop and assess each individual tree, this is another deliverable that is, I believe, probably one of the most powerful pieces that can come out of a tree management plan. And what this is showing is a very quick overview of species types within the entire community, and then an asset value of what these trees lend to the community. And that asset value is measuring critical components like stormwater retention, heating and cooling benefits, carbon exchange, and so on and so forth, property value. These are not replacement values, but more along the lines of environmental impact values. And so in this example, you can see, the net worth of the trees is 1.7, almost $1.8 million. And so utilizing that asset value to then relate to the actual tree plan that's developed and created to assist with budgeting. Any questions thus far?
No, it seems very, very, very thorough assessment, Chris.
Excellent. And so after we capture all of this information, we then do a full physical of each tree. And we're assessing the trees top to bottom, inside and out, if you will. We're looking at things like, are there current insects that are impacting the overall vigor, health, and wellness of the trees and or shrubs? And I say and or shrubs because a lot of communities tend to slide their shrubs out of the urban forest and really just have those as a line item, if you will, for grounds maintenance. And the landscape maintenance company performs the service on the shrubs. And if I may highlight a little bit about the benefits of it versus the non-benefits or the impacts of a lawn service provider performing those horticultural practices. So when we look at shrub management, there's a lot of shrubs in our landscape that flower on new wood and or old wood, depending on the species of plant. And I'll use lilac, for example. Many communities throughout the metro have lilacs, whether they're common lilacs, dwarf Korean, Miss Kim lilacs, doesn't much matter. Those plants flower on last year's wood. And so understanding the science behind and the biology behind each plant is critical in the succession of the design concept, meaning the flower show, if you will. And, pruning practices and the timing of that is critical in the success of that flower show. And so many communities that I have consulted with and or manage have never seen a lot of their shrubs flower. And the main reason is the timing of the service or the pruning that's involved. Most contracts involve 2 pruning cycles on the shrubs. And in many cases, that is defeating the purpose of that plant. Now, that being said, there also needs to be a fine line to walk, if you will, in maintaining, the overall size of each plant relative to their location. Example would be windows. And a lot of governing documents specifically state that the shrubs cannot be higher than the windowsill. And so, that becomes a conversation of wrong plant, wrong location, and what is the sustainability of that plant given that location and those governing documents, if you will. And so when we look at shrub management, we're really looking at the science behind each plant and things like rejuvenation pruning, renewal pruning, and then pruning with hand pruners to allow the plants to maximize their natural form and beauty. Now, all of that clearly comes with a cost associated with it because it's a lot more technical form of management of those plants versus the standard, shearing and shaping into what we call gumballs, tiny little individual plants versus allowing each plant to maximize its capabilities and potentials into mass plantings. But then as we look at shrubs or trees rather, when we do that full assessment, there's a lot more involved than a simple pruning cycle, whether it's renewal, rejuvenation, or standard maintenance. We're looking at really the long-term health and sustainability of each tree. And what does that look like based on the science behind each one of those species relative to the impacts of the individual pest that's impacting that tree and or disease. And so before the meeting started, there was a question about conifers, spruce trees in particular. And I want to touch base on the spruce trees and the conifers. I think the reality is a lot of our conifers that exist in our urban forest are non-native. And the non-native spruce are Colorado blue and green spruce. And so planted in the upper Midwest, typically for the color, that bluish mint green pigment, is why those are so desirable. Now, that being said, they do not tolerate our growing environment. Our summers are, quite frankly, just too humid for those plants to thrive and be sustainable. It's very typical that as those trees reach roughly that 20-year-old mark within the urban forest, they begin to show signs of stress or decline. A lot of that comes from, one, our humidity, our climate that these trees are forced to grow in, as well as the irrigation that tends to constantly keep those needles moist. And with any fungus, moisture is one of the key components in really completing the life cycle of that fungal pathogen. And so if we look at what does it take to manage this particular tree species, Colorado blue spruce, we really need to start with cultural practices. So can we, reduce the irrigation that is impacting or contacting the needle sets on those trees on a daily basis in many cases, if not, multiple times throughout the week, throughout the entire growing season. And if that's not a possibility, there's really no chemical treatment that is going to be acceptable control within a urban forest management strategy, because we have to get that moisture off of those needles in order for any type of fungicides to really be successful. The other thing that really impacts Colorado blue spruce is Cytospora canker, which is a vascular tissue disease. It gets into the phloem tissue and the xylem tissue of these trees, and it sits in the trees as a latent infection, kind of like a cold in our body. It takes a certain amount of environmental stress and pressures to move that pathogen out to the tips of the trees, and it causes sporadic mortality throughout the crown. And essentially, once a limb gets infected, there's a spore that erupts on the top side of the limb and drips down, infects lower limbs within the canopy of the tree. It's very sporadic mortality. And that pathogen will kill a tree in fairly quick order if it's not managed properly. And that protocol would be isolation of the infected tissue, and then injecting a soil systemic product called Cambistat, which is the only research product through university research that shows efficacy on suppressing this pathogen. And that's effective for 3 years. So that's part of a strategy within a management plan. But as we continue to look at the broader spectrum of a management plan, it's a very detailed and complex assessment. Once again, looking at every single tree as an individual unit within the greater community of the urban forest, and looking at items such as pruning, cycles. So pruning for structural integrity, depending on the age class of the trees, pruning for general maintenance practices. Example, removing dead wood and crossing limbs, raising canopies over driveways and roads for safety, and clearing building structure as well to aid and mitigate with any damage that could be associated to branches rubbing on shingles or soffit and siding, things like that. And then there's a higher level, a very technical form of pruning called subordinational pruning. And a lot of times subordinational pruning is utilized on our hybrid trees like autumn blaze maples and the new varieties of hybrid elms, even all the way to our common hackberry trees in their early juvenile to adolescent age class in the trees, training the trees rather on where to put their energy. Put it to codominant leaders, which are less than desirable leads in a tree that have a higher risk of failure, or putting all of that energy towards a central dominant leader for the future of that tree's growth. So isolating out specific branches and redirecting the tree's energy would be all part of a strategy in a tree management plan from a pruning perspective. More often than not, certified arborists get called out to communities to assess trees because they don't look good. And more often than not, when we come into those types of situations, the trees are beyond repair. And I think, you know, the entire concept of strategic tree management plans and shrub management plans is to shift that dynamic from a reactionary mindset to a proactive and strategic plan moving forward, and really looking at a plan as catching up on deferred maintenance. And in talking with several communities throughout the metro, and it always comes down to deferred maintenance. And that's all relative to budget constraints or limitations, not knowing potentially what to budget for based on, for lack of a better term, lack of knowledge of what's existing in that urban forest. And so once again, going back to the tree management plan, we touch base on pruning, we touch base on shrubs. There's two other main areas to really have a conversation about, and that is disease insect management and soils. I would like to start with soils. Soil types relative to tree success and sustainability. Throughout the greater metro, a lot of our soil type is heavy compacted clays and or the complete opposite extreme with sandy soil types. The most common soil types that we see are heavy compacted clays with extremely high pH levels. You know, on average, over many thousands of soil analysis that we sent into laboratories for complete assessments and overviews of that soil, the pH level comes back at 7.8 to 8.2, which is extremely high. And the organic matter content is 1 to 1.5% organic, which is very low. And if we go through a 101 class on soil biology, we know that as our pH increases and our organic content decreases, the essential elements which within the soil profile are no longer available or free for the roots of the trees or plants to absorb naturally. And so if you've gone through a forest and you look at the forest floor the propagation of seed source relative to a mature tree exists with very little input, next to no input from humans. The beauty of the urban forest is there's all this natural decomposition of leaf litter and twigs that fall out of the canopies of the trees and decompose over time, creating natural organic content, which is very loamy. It's full of oxygen, pore spaces for those roots to develop in. And all of that organic content frees up all the essential elements for the trees. And so the question always becomes, why do we within our urban forests need to have so much human input or utilize, supplements, fungicides, insecticides, pesticides, all of that fun stuff that is challenging to manage with, especially a lot of the bee colony collapse concerns and environmental concerns. And the reality is we're in an urban forest, which is a completely different setting. So if we kind of spin around and do a 180 and come out of that forest floor setting, that's all organic content and nice and loamy, free of, rocks and lawn, if you will, and look at what our urban forest is really, designed to do. It's green space, it's rock landscaping with a couple shrubs and perennials here and there. And we as humans like it clean and manicured, right? So we're cutting grass once a week. In many cases, we have grass that grows beneath the trees and right up to the trunks of the trees, robbing those trees from water and nutrients and the ability to absorb. And with all of that, we have compaction on clay soils with, once again, high pH levels, low organic content. And so our trees are really struggling to get the adequate nutrients that's necessary to promote long-term sustainable health. And with that impact, our insects and diseases attack, if you will, those trees, and the trees just don't have enough what we call reserves to naturally defend themselves or protect themselves like the trees in the forest do. And so that's where the inputs come into play. When we look at soils, we look at the type of soil, once again, the pH level, the organic content, and then we're looking at the tree species. So the example would be, if you're familiar with a red maple, a white oak, a river birch, or lack thereof, any type of birch tree, it's likely that you've seen pale green to neon yellow leaf tissue exist on those trees at some point in their life. And that is a deficiency called chlorosis, which is a limitation of the tree's ability to absorb adequate nutrients out of that soil. When we look at specific tree species and through our assessments, based on science, we know, for example, if a river birch is chlorotic, it's deficient in iron. And so based on that knowledge, we can prescribe iron to that individual tree in many different forms or tools that we can utilize as arborists in our toolbox. One service may be root enhancement, which the easiest way to describe that service is open heart surgery for a tree. We remove the grass that's underneath that individual tree, typically in a 3-foot radius ring. We go into that interface with a tool called an air spade, decompact that soil profile, add organic content and biochar, and mulch it. That is essentially mimicking the forest floor in the urban environment. That would be the most sustainable solution to overcome any soil deficiencies. On top of that, there's also tree nutrition that could be prescribed, prescribing the essential elements that that tree needs based on the deficiency. There's also Cambistat, which can be utilized, and or direct iron and manganese injections into the tree, once again, depending on the species. So that would cover soil deficiencies within a tree management plan. The next topic would be pests, insects, and diseases. And so as we look at this pie chart, we see the quantity of 31 crabapple trees. And I pick on crabapples because that's the most commonly planted ornamental tree. They're beautiful in the spring when they're in full flower. You know, flowers the past couple of years have been extraordinarily beautiful. They've lasted a very long time relative to, you know, the typical crabapple that may be in bloom for 3 to 5 days. We've been getting weeks out of them because of our cooler springs. And, you know, this year we would have had a lot more flower show, but we got 55 degrees and we went up into the upper, you know, mid to upper 80s for 3 days in a row with dry conditions. And that stress causes those trees to shed their blossoms early. But I pick on the crabapple because apple scab is very, very common, the most common fungal disease that impacts our ornamental trees. And so having that inventory can strategically plan for treatment protection on that specific species of trees. Then we kind of float around to the green ash susceptible to emerald ash borer. And I should note that all of our native ash trees, whether they're green, black, or white, are highly susceptible to emerald ash borer. And within the plan, the assessment is the key component. And the assessment goes something like this. Looking at overall health and or condition of the tree, the vigor of the tree, the location of the tree, where is this tree planted relative to building structures, roadways, driveways, if you will, and other existing trees within the urban forest. And then looking at the overall structural integrity of the tree, the branching structure. Are there splits? Are there codominant leaders that are of concern of failure within that crown of the tree? That is all going to be key assessment points to dictate whether or not that individual tree amongst the greater urban forest would warrant treatment protection. If the tree doesn't meet any of that criteria, it would be classified as a strategic removal. Once again, looking back on its health and its structural integrity relative to its location within a plan, typically a plan exists for 5 years, that tree would be identified somewhere in the 5-year period of that plan to be removed based on its condition and its location. Then from that removal strategy, we would also look at within that plan, is there a tree that needs to be reforested or replanted to replace that removed tree? And if so, what type of species do we plant with? Clearly, we want to be selecting a diverse population. And I think that is, in many cases, in many communities, the missing component to success is tree species diversity. And, you know, really looking at if that space where the tree got removed can support a new tree, what is the best fit of species for that location? So looking at the space that's available for a new tree to grow in and be sustainable is a key component, because the last thing that anybody is going to want is to plant the tree that is going to grow much too large for that space, increasing the general maintenance of that tree and creating upset in the future. And if there's anything that's taken away from this conversation, there's a couple key words: sustainability and future-based. Looking at future-based practices today that creates the sustainability for future generations to live into. That's really the whole intent of a tree management plan. Yes, there's a lot of power around the tools that are provided from a budgeting perspective, but really at the end of the day, it's creating a sustainable future at the end of this plan and reducing the general reactionary maintenance. And so we touched base on very, I'll say 101, almost, middle school type overview of a tree management plan. And I will say that in the development and or the creation of a strategic plan, once again, every tree is fully assessed. And during that development stage and the inventory capturing, we will identify every and any insect and or disease that is present on those plants or trees at the given time of the inventory. One key distinction to get our arms wrapped around is we do not look at any crystal ball what ifs type scenarios or situations. That being said, I say that because the last thing we want to do is predict what may be possible. If we look at spruce trees, generally speaking, and we can say white spruce trees, those are a native spruce or a Black Hill spruce. There are so many insects that are potential candidates for that tree that we would be prescribing treatments to that group of trees or that species of trees that would have a technician on the property almost weekly throughout the spring, treating for an insect that doesn't even exist. And so in the plan, there's scouting events called integrated pest management. And in that integrated pest management, what we do is, based on the inventory and the species that exist, we know through science there's very specific trigger points, what we call growing degree days. Every insect, every pathogen is triggered by a growing degree day. For example, we know European pine sawfly that impacts pine trees and spruce trees typically comes out into the environment or hatches from their egg set right around 225 growing degree days. For some odd reason this year, they began to hatch at 155 growing degree days, which is extremely early when you look at how growing degree days accumulate over the duration of an entire year. And so a lot of that has to do with microclimates, reflective heat, quicker warming of soils in southern exposures or western exposure trees. And so identifying that throughout a plan is a key component to this success as well. And so when you really look at the overview of a tree management plan is going to capture everything and anything that deals with soil limitations and deficiencies, girdling root issues, which are roots that essentially grow around the base of the tree and strangle the trunk tissue of the tree. strategic pruning and removals, reforestation, and insect and disease management, all based on science practices and protocols that will deliver predictable results. And so now I'm gonna shift over to an example of what a tree management plan looks like. And once again, this is just an example of what a tree management plan looks like. It speaks of the full assessment. Everyone can see this, I'm assuming.
We have the originals. The previous slide is still visible, Chris.
Bear with me here. Jody, you know how to do this share? I get some IT support here. Sharing's paused. I want to get into this. Mhm. Can we see that now?
It looks like the previous slides, Chris.
How about now?
Yeah, it's a text document. Yes, it's a tree management plan.
Perfect. Thank you. Sorry about that. So when we look at the tree management document, this is another deliverable. This is the blueprint, if you will, of the actual tree management plan. So the first page here just speaks around, you know, what a tree management involves and how we go about assessing the property. It speaks around, you know, really looking at shifting the mindset of reactionary maintenance to proactive, and the values that the trees lend to the community. And then this is what a plan may look like, excuse me, depending on, you know, when that plan was created, developed. And so you can see here, there's bullet points with specific services, with tree numbers associated with each service, and then a budgeted or an estimated investment for each individual season. And as we scroll through, you know, this season for this individual example was created mid-season. And so there's certain things in arboriculture that just simply can't be done because the time window of opportunity has passed. And as we look into that next growing season, that's essentially when the full plan would be developed and implemented for that individual community. And so as we look down this list, there's several different services that are essentially doing different things for different trees based on those current conditions, once again, on that individual property. So you see there's technical pruning, there's removals, there's stump grinding, there's insect and disease management, there's soil remediation with root collar examinations and root enhancement, and then also prescribing nutrition to manage deficiencies within that soil, and then a reforestation of a swamp white oak in this example. And then once again, the estimated investment for that growing season. And that list continues to go. And what I'm doing is I'm showing the difference in year to year needs based on that assessment and those trees that are within the community. So nothing is ever the same. Matter of fact, everything is always different based on the overall assessment. And the budgets are all laid out very specific, and board members, property managers, the overall community will be able to see everything that is planned out. I know this through dealing with a lot of communities that, you know, every homeowner has their own tree in their yard, and they're very interested in, you know, what is going to be done to my tree as the homeowner. And within this plan, within the general inventory that's created, each homeowner has access to viewing what tree is on, quote unquote, their property within the community. And that is essentially what a tree management plan could look like. Again, this is an example. It could be a lot more complex. It can be very specific to maybe only inventorying ash trees and creating a management strategy to only deal with ash trees, or maybe it's just shrubs, maybe it's just trees, maybe it's a combination of both. They're very customized and can be driven by any objective within each individual community. So at this point, that was an overview of the inventory, the asset charts and graphs, and then the actual blueprint, as we like to call it, the roadmap of managing the urban forest and urban landscape within the community. And I realize this is a very quick overview. It may sound or come across very long-winded. There's a lot of detail involved in the assessments. And, you know, at the end of the day, once again, it is about shifting the mindset of reactionary management of trees and shrubs to a very strategic and proactive mindset that's sustainable for future generations. And so at this point, I would open the floor to questions, concerns, comments, or anything in between.
Mhm.
Chris, I have a question. This obviously takes a lot of time and effort to make this inventory. How does a townhome community start this process? Is the inventory part of the bid process where you give us a bid on what you anticipate, or can you explain how that process works?
Sure, good question. So typically, when a community is interested in the creation of an inventory and tree management plan, a consulting arborist like myself would come out to the community and basically do a walkthrough of the property. And the walkthrough is just an overview to understand the lay of the land, if you will, and an approximate number of how many trees are involved or what level of tree species we're working with or looking at. And at that point, then we would present a proposal to create and develop a tree management plan for the community. And I'm going to just make up an example. Property ABC will develop a tree management plan and inventory that creates a roadmap over the next 5 years based on full assessments of insect and disease management for all trees in the manicured area, meaning any space that's being maintained. In some communities, there's wooded parcels within the community. We do not go into the woods and identify every single tree, although we can. It's typically not a request. So we specify that it will be in the manicured areas, and the price to do that, or the investment to do that, is X dollars. And the inventories can range from, hundreds of dollars into thousands of dollars, depending on how many trees we're looking at inventorying and assessing and developing that plan. It's very typical that, the common range is between $4 and $8 per tree to inventory and develop a plan. Now, that being said, that's an estimate. But more importantly, the power behind that walkthrough to create the proposal in developing the inventory would be the real investment to the community to create this plan. And then the deliverables are everything that we just kind of did an overview of. You get the 5-year blueprint, the inventory map, the asset values, and the pie charts showing the species diversity and makeup. And then at that point, I'm always happy to present that plan to the board or landscape committee, or a combination of both, and go over it, at a high level of detail based on the individual needs from that assessment.
Okay, thank you, Chris.
You're welcome.
Chris, I had a question. Short of having a management plan, could you give some recommendations on priorities in terms of just looking at the typical kinds of trees that we might have? What would be maybe the priorities a board should be looking at or concerned about?
Sure. Good question there. So typically, priorities without even seeing a property is, if there's an understanding that the community has ash trees, I would say, given the time of year we're in right now, that, the end of May here, the adult emerald ash borer will begin to pupate out of trees at any point coming up here. It's very typical they pupate out at the end of May, early part of June, and will continue to do that over the next 3 months. That being said, a full assessment of ash trees, I would say at this point of the season, is extremely critical in knowing, one, we have X amount of ash trees, and then 2, having an actual plan to manage those ash trees. And for us, or myself, to come out to a community and look at, okay, do we have ash trees or not? There's no charge to that. If we come out and we just go through and look for ash trees, there's no charge for that, and we'll actually create a list of recommendations based on our findings of ash trees or not. And that's a critical component right now. The next critical component would be managing conifers, and conifers being spruce trees and or pine trees, the long needled pines. There's a lot of insects and diseases that are impacting those conifers currently. And I think the reality is we're right at the critical stage of their development where we could still make a difference. Unlike, for example, crab apples. Apple scab, it's done with. There's nothing we can do at this point in the season to protect those trees from apple scab. It's a very, very early spring treatment application. So really understanding, once again, the species and the life cycle, that's the key. Does that make sense, Lynn? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Very good. So there was a message from Terry in the chat that talks about, how do we plan as an organization if we want to reduce chemical usage on trees. And so I think that's a very challenging objective, to reduce chemical usage. That would really be driven on, what type of chemical is being used and for what reason. Or another way to say that would be, what insect and or disease would we be looking at managing? And then are there alternative measures that can be taken to reduce the chemical usage? But I want to highlight that when we look at chemicals, there's very specific chemicals that are utilized for very specific insects and or diseases. And most of the products that are utilized are extremely safe for our environment and humans, if you will. And it all comes down to right application, right rates, and following the label on that individual product, which the label is the law. Not saying that people follow it all the time. I'm sure you can go to Home Depot on a Saturday and find people purchasing the product 7 in a red bottle, and when Japanese beetles show up, I almost guarantee you that that product is getting sprayed on roses, which is a violation. They should not be applying that product to flowering plants. But more often than not, people never read that label on how to use it and why you're using it. So that's kind of a very gray question / answer to the concern, but hopefully there's a little bit of benefit that you've taken out of that, Terry. Also in the chat, there was a, what is the canker treatment every 3 years that you talked about on spruce trees, from Roger. Roger, that treatment is called Cambistat, and the canker that you're treating for in that case is called Cytospora canker. And that is very specific to Colorado spruce. Whether they're blue spruce or green spruce doesn't much make a difference. They're Colorado spruce. And Cytospora canker tends to show up in those spruce trees more often than you would see it on a Black Hill spruce and or white spruce, Norway spruce. Not saying that those trees cannot get it. They definitely can, but it's a lot more prevalent in your Colorado spruce trees. Marilyn just sent in a chat about Japanese beetle in south central Minnesota. How does one treat for this insect? So Japanese beetle, it's a cyclical insect, and their populations are growing currently in our environment. If we look back to 2013, hopefully everyone can remember the polar vortex. And that year we had extremely cold temperatures throughout the winter for a very, very long time, with not a lot of snowpack. And Japanese beetle overwinters in the soil as a grub. And they're a very deep diving grub, meaning they go deep into the soil profile to overwinter and protect themselves from frost. Mother Nature is a very good control measure of Japanese beetle grubs, so long as we get frost that exceeds 3 feet. If we don't get frost that exceeds 3 feet, Mother Nature doesn't help us manage this invasive pest. So that being said, we look at the past, we'll call it 4 years, we've been increasing the population of Japanese beetle, because 2013 essentially wiped out the population next to nothing. And we never saw a rebound until we got into that 2016, 2017 growing season. And so now the populations have increased over time, and we just haven't had the winters to knock back that population. And so management strategy is going to be very dictated by species of tree to manage. Now, Japanese beetle, they'll feed on 300 different species of shrubs and trees. However, in the urban forest, if you will, they target very specific trees like basswoods or lindens, your tilia plants, river birch, crab apples. Hybrid elms is, I believe, becoming their favorite food source. It sure seems they are very attracted to hybrid elms. And so each one of those trees can warrant a different treatment measure. But from a proactive standpoint, soil systemics is the best way to manage Japanese beetle. The limitation exists in the Tilia family of trees. There's only really 2 products that can be utilized on Japanese beetle management for that Tilia plant. One is a soil systemic utilizing Lepitect after the trees are done flowering. Now, the challenge with Japanese beetle on linden trees or tilia trees, basswood trees, is those trees are in full flower when the adults are pupating out of the soil. And so there is going to be a window of lost opportunity for approximately 2 to 2.5 weeks as those trees fade in their flower. At that point, then you could apply a soil systemic and it'll cover those trees for the duration of the adult's life cycle above ground. The only other option would be to do a foliar spray on those trees when they are in full flower, utilizing a product called Acelyprin. And that is the only product in the market to this day that's labeled and licensed to be applied to flowering plants to control Japanese beetle and not have an impact on bees. So it's very, very critical to understand the type of tree and or plant that Japanese beetles impacting, and then what products are acceptable to be applied to those trees. Does that answer your question?
Chris, I have a question. Our association is around 20 years old, and I think many associations might be older than that. So we have a lot of mature trees and shrubs. Have there been new varieties that are developed that are going to be better suited to use in 2021 in our area?
Absolutely. Has been a wide range of hybrid trees that have been propagated and, essentially tried in the environment for many years before they get released into nursery stock, if you will. Some examples would be hybrid oaks like Crimson Spire oak, Majestic Skies oak, the Swamp White oak, Regal Prince oak. And so the list can go on, Kinder Spirit oak. They all serve different functionalities in the urban forest, meaning their sizes are different. Their canopy at maturity is completely different than maybe what most people might recall the red oak or the white oak, bur oak. So they're great opportunities to implement those trees. Hybrid elms, there's many different types of hybrid elms, but some really good performers would be Accolade elm, Triumph elm, Princeton elm, Valley Forge elm. And so that list can go on. many different types of crab apples. Some are bred for resistance to apple scab. Some are bred for non-fruit bearing. Now I say that kind of lightly because resistance in the tree world is just a matter of time. When they're exposed to millions, maybe billions of spores annually, at some point they're going to get apple scab. It's inevitable. But for maybe the first 3 to 7 years of their life, they may never come to apple scab. And then there's lots of new trees that are, I shouldn't say new, they're old trees that have a new life to them, for lack of a better term. Sycamores, beech trees, even some of our maples are all new strands and seed sources that are hybrids to be more desirable in overall size of tree. And I think the more critical thing is zone hardiness. You know, our zone has changed dramatically over the last few years, and it's going to continue to change. And there's a lot of great research being done and data that supports change in the next 15 to 20 years. And so, you know, constantly being in tune to that and not being afraid to try new things is the sustainable approach. But there's tons of new things out there and always will be. I think there's a lot of science and research that is always in the works for plants and trees.
Chris, it looks like there's a question in the chat.
Yeah, there's two of them. So one of them is what's best in regards to spruce, Norway or white? I would say both of them are great opportunities when you look at spruce trees. You know, white spruce is more of your standard spruce tree versus a Norway tends to have what I call more curtain-like boughs. They tend to droop down at maturity. They have kind of a archy backbone to them, and then the needles actually drape downward, but they're both great candidates. I will say, you know, if I look at insect management, both of those trees have a high likelihood of getting what's called spruce bud scale, which is a easy insect to manage, but it's likely that they'll get that. And there's nothing wrong with planting those trees. It's just, you know, understanding that at some point in its life, they're going to get this insect, and then you just got to deal with the insect. And it's very typical, one treatment and it wiped those insects out. And then you go back to scouting and just managing the tree's health at that point. But both of those are great selections for Minnesota. There's also a lot of hybrids out there with spruce and pine trees. You know, some of my favorite would be Swiss stone pines. They're a very columnar type pine tree, but they're beautiful in their color. The bottom side of the needle is actually silvery gray, and the top sides are really, really dark, rich green. And then you also have like Serbian spruce trees, which are beautiful trees. They're very tight in their form and branching structure, and a whole list of many, many more. But, you know, white pines, underplanted tree. You go up north and you see the big, majestic white pines all over up there. There's no reason we can't have them grow in the metro area. It's just people are afraid to try something different because it's not very common. But blue spruce trees are very common and they shouldn't be planted. But if anyone's gone to Costco over the last month, they have pallets of little 3-foot blue spruce for sale. And, you know, the marketing around it is blue is cool. And everyone wants that hue of blue in the landscape. But I think the reality is there's a tree called a concolor white fir that most people would not even know it's a fir tree and think it was a blue spruce tree. It has very, very similar, maybe better blue hues to it, and they perform great in our urban forest. They like our soil type, and there's really no insects or diseases that impact the life of the tree. You may get aphids on them every now and again, but nothing crazy. Another chat here is spraying for Japanese beetle with Dawn dish soap. You know, you definitely can do it. The Dawn dish soap has a tendency to simply knock down any kind of insect like Japanese beetle, Asian beetle, box elder bugs, but it doesn't necessarily kill that insect. And so the tendency for a return is increased. So insecticide is going to be the best measure. Otherwise, you can hand pick them and put them in a water bottle or a bucket of water, and they'll essentially drown in that water. Any other questions, concerns, comments for me?
Well, Chris,
Ken, you're muted.
Unmute. Okay. I live in a senior cooperative building, and if anything, we are overplanted. We're 20 years old. Trees are growing into one another. What do you do in a situation like that? Serious pruning or whatever?
Yeah, good question. That's a pretty common issue that we run into with overplanting. A lot of that's dictated by, you know, cities and their landscape plan requirements. Typically what we do is, again, develop an inventory and assess the trees to see, okay, what are we dealing with first and foremost? Are we dealing with spruce trees that are growing, you know, too close together and they're competing for sunlight? And in that case, you almost have to treat that group of trees, if you will, as one unit versus individual trees, because it's a domino effect on the suppression that has occurred from the lack of sunlight. And so if you take out one tree, it's inevitable that there's going to be mortality or dead zones in the two, you know, neighboring trees. And so that becomes unsightly as well. And then, you know, if you're dealing with deciduous versus coniferous, you want to look at the species of tree relative to how much of that canopy or crown is being compromised and what tree would be the best candidate for the future. And then you would remove, you know, the weaker link of the two, if you will.
Okay.
well, thank you, Chris. I'm impressed with your level of knowledge about trees and how important they are to manage well.
Very good. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Chris, could you mention how to reach you? Could you give us your maybe email or phone number, and we'll follow up with a notice to our members. But in case anybody would like to reach you today, could you give us your email and phone number?
I sure can. My email is C for Chris, and then my last name, which if you're viewing the screen, you'll see my last name in my little block, if you will, but it's C Naselli. That's Naselli at Rainbow Treecare, all one word, rainbowtreecare.com. So again, that email would be cnaselli@rainbowtreecare.com. And then in order to reach me and set up a opportunity to either meet in person on site and or for me just to come out to a community and have a look around on my own, a way to schedule that or to get that accomplished would be to call our commercial line, which is 952-252-0589. 952-252-0589. And our customer service team would be able to look in my calendar and align whatever it is that needs to be aligned and make it happen. So once again, I really appreciate everyone's questions and attention, and I hope there was value in this conversation. Again, you know, it's a conversation around a lot of very detailed assessment. And in this event, you know, sometimes it's hard to express the level of detail that's involved in a tree management plan when we're talking really fairy tale type stuff at this point. But everything and anything is possible when we're looking at managing trees future.